The morning broke with a dull gray light, the kind that barely managed to push back the weight of winter's chill. Frost clung to the edges of the rancher's barn, and his breath came out in little puffs of steam as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was warmer than outside, thick with the scent of hay, leather, and animals stirring in the stalls. It was a morning like countless others, yet something in the stillness felt different. The rancher moved with the steady rhythm of habit, boots crunching over straw, hands rough from years of work. He was a man accustomed to silence. His cattle, his horses, and the wind were his only company. But that morning, beneath the rustle of animals and the groan of the barn's beams, came another sound. A faint rustling, not like livestock shifting, but lighter, hesitant, almost desperate. He narrowed his eyes, tilting his head. His hand instinctively brushed the revolver at his hip, though he doubted a thief would be foolish enough to hide in his barn. Still, he followed the sound to the far corner, where shadows pooled thickest against the bales of hay. There, crouched low and half buried in straw, was not a man at all, but a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. Her face was streaked with dirt, her hair tangled into uncombed knots. Clothes hung from her like rags, torn at the elbows and knees, threadbare enough to let the cold cut straight through. Her hands clutched a sack so small and empty, it seemed more like a scrap of cloth than anything useful. Her eyes, wide, hollow, and brimming with fear, locked on his as though she'd been cornered like a wild creature. The rancher froze. She was too thin, not the kind of thin that comes from skipping a meal, but the kind that came from weeks, maybe months, of gnawing hunger. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked and pale. What in blazes? His voice came out rougher than he intended, a low growl that made her flinch. He saw it then, crumbs scattered at her feet, feed meant for the livestock. A crust of something clutched tight in her small hand, as if she feared he'd rip it away. "You been stealin' from me?" His words carried the sharp edge of suspicion, born of long years protecting what was his. The girl said nothing. Her throat worked like she wanted to speak, but only a rasp came out. Her eyes dropped, staring at the barn floor, shoulders trembling as if she expected the blow of a boot or the crack of a whip. The rancher's jaw clenched. He reached down and yanked the sack from her grasp, holding it up to the light. For a moment he expected to see it stuffed with feed or tools she'd tried to take. Instead, it sagged limp in his grip, holding nothing but a single scrap of stale bread, so hard it might have broken a tooth. That was all. His chest tightened in a way he didn't like. She hadn't come to rob him. She'd come to survive. The barn felt suddenly colder, despite the breath of warmth from the animals. He stood there, staring at the pitiful scrap in the sack, the girl's ragged frame, and the way her hands shook not from guilt, but from hunger. The rancher let out a slow breath, heavy as the dawn outside. This wasn't theft, this was desperation, and for the first time in years, his steady, predictable world felt shaken. The rancher stood there for a long moment, sack dangling from his fist, silence pressing heavy in the barn. The girl still crouched in the hay, eyes darting like a cornered animal, but she made no move to run. She didn't have the strength. He could see it in her bones, in the way her thin shoulders sagged under the weight of her own hunger. He was a man of means, land stretching wide under his name, cattle enough to make him comfortable, barns stocked against the winter. Yet wealth hadn't made him soft. If anything, it had hardened him. Neighbors called him a man with iron in his veins, hard-working, distant, alone by choice. His land was full, but his house was empty, and he intended to keep it that way. At least until now. "Who do you belong to?" His voice cut through the stillness, deep and uncompromising. The girl's lips parted, but her voice was so faint he almost missed it. "No one." The words echoed in the rafters, more haunting than the winter wind. For a heartbeat, the rancher just stared at her, chest tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years. No father, no mother, no kin to speak her name, no one. He swore under his breath, and tossed the sack aside. "On your feet." She scrambled awkwardly, nearly stumbling as she tried to stand. Her legs wobbled like twigs, thin as sticks in her ragged boots. For a second he thought she might collapse right there in the hay, but somehow, she steadied herself, clutching the stall wall. He turned sharply and headed for the barn doors, his boots striking hard against the boards. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, footsteps dragging, like a shadow afraid of being left behind. Inside the ranch house, the air was warmer, though not by much. The kitchen was plain, sturdy, built for function, not comfort. A wooden table, a cold hearth, and shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. The rancher struck a match, lit the fire, and set a loaf of bread and a tin cup of water on the table. He said nothing, just jerked his chin toward the food. The girl's eyes widened, disbelief flickering across her face. Then hunger overtook hesitation. She lunged forward, hands trembling as she tore into the bread, cramming too much into her mouth at once. She chewed and swallowed so quickly she coughed, choking as crumbs caught in her throat. "Easy," he muttered, pouring water into the cup and sliding it toward her. She grabbed it, gulping it down in ragged swallows, tears springing to her eyes as if the simple act of drinking hurt. She wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve, then clutched the bread again, eating slower now, but no less desperate. The rancher leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, watching. Every bite she took tightened the knot in his chest. He'd seen hunger before, in cattle, in horses, in men who'd fallen on hard times. But this was different. She wasn't just empty. She was starved of everything: food, warmth, kindness, and he knew what people would say if they found her here. Fool man, they'd call him. Taking in a stray, feeding another mouth when he doesn't need to. The town would laugh behind his back, mutter that he'd gone soft. A rancher of his standing didn't waste time or bread on orphans who belonged to no one. Yet as he looked at her, hunched small over the table, guarding each bite of bread like it was treasure, he couldn't bring himself to care. When the loaf was nearly gone, he pushed away from the counter, his face hardening again. "You'll stay here tonight." The words landed heavy in the room. The girl froze, bread halfway to her mouth, eyes wide, but the rancher turned away before she could answer. His jaw was set, his shoulders stiff, like a man already regretting his own decision. Because he knew what it meant. It wasn't just a place by the fire, it wasn't just a meal, it was a choice. The orphan stayed. At first it was meant to be for a night, one night, he told himself, until she found her strength. But dawn came, and the girl was still there, curled up on the rug by the fire, as if she'd been afraid to claim a bed. The faint glow of morning painted her face pale, but there was less of that wild, hunted look in her eyes, still wary, still ready to flee, but not quite as broken as when he'd found her in the barn. The rancher cleared his throat, a sound that made her jolt upright, heart racing. He frowned at her reaction, though it wasn't anger that furrowed his brow, it was something closer to guilt. "You can't sleep on the floor," he muttered. He fetched an old quilt from the chest and dropped it into her lap. She held it like it was silk spun from heaven, her fingers curling into the faded fabric. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them expected. He set food on the table each morning, each night, bread, beans, stew when he had it. She ate carefully at first, always keeping one eye on him, stuffing crumbs into her pockets when she thought he wasn't looking. More than once, he found little piles of bread hidden beneath her pillow or tucked into her shoes. She was still living in hunger's shadow, unable to believe the meals would keep coming. The rancher didn't scold her. He just sighed, collected the stale crumbs, and left the next portion a little bigger. Slowly her hoarding lessened. He gave her simple tasks, fetching water from the pump, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens. She took to the work eagerly, as though afraid idleness might make her unwelcome. She never complained, never asked for more than what she was given, and though she flinched whenever his boots thudded too loud on the wooden floor, or when he turned too quickly near her, she began to lift her eyes toward him more often. Evenings were the strangest. The rancher had lived in silence for years, with nothing but the crackle of firewood and the howl of coyotes beyond his windows. But now, another presence filled the room. She sat near the hearth, small hands wrapped around a tin cup, eyes reflecting the firelight. She didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. Her silence was different from his. Hers was born of fear, his of habit. Yet somehow, together the silence felt softer. One night, she smiled. It was faint, fleeting, but real. He'd ladled stew into her bowl, and set a slice of bread beside it, and as she lifted her face to thank him, though no words came, her lips curved just slightly. It stopped him cold. He couldn't remember the last time someone had smiled in this house. The sight stirred something deep in him, something he thought he'd buried alongside old griefs he never spoke of. Compassion, protectiveness, a warmth he didn't trust. When he went to his bed that night, he lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling beams. Just for now, he whispered to the darkness, convincing himself it was temporary. He'd give her food, shelter, time to mend, then she'd move on. But the longer he listened to the quiet sound of her breathing in the other room, steady and safe at last, the less he believed his own words. It didn't take long for whispers to crawl from his ranch into town. Whispers never stayed whispers long in a place where every saloon glass and church pew doubled as a mouthpiece for gossip. He took in a beggar girl. Someone muttered by the mercantile counter, found her stealin' in his barn, and instead of tossin' her out, he fed her. Foolishness. That stray'll ruin him. By the week's end, the rumors had thickened into hard opinion. The rancher, once respected if not liked, was now the subject of jeers and shaken heads. Men in the saloon said he'd gone soft. Women at the well muttered that the girl would curse his name. Even the preacher shook his head with disapproval, whispering about charity misplaced. The rancher, for his part, ignored it. He'd never built his life on others' approval. But the storm didn't stay in whispers. It came to his door. One cold evening, boots crunched in the yard outside his ranch house. The girl, sitting by the fire with a scrap of embroidery she'd been trying to copy, stiffened. She peered through the window and saw lanterns bobbing in the dark, half a dozen men marching toward the porch. The rancher opened the door before they could knock. He stood framed in the lamplight, broad shoulders filling the doorway, his face set in stone. Even in, Sheriff Danner said, tipping his hat stiffly. He was flanked by two rival ranchers and three townsmen, all carrying the same look of judgment. The lead rancher, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, didn't bother with courtesy. "We hear you've taken in something that don't belong to you." The rancher's jaw tightened. "She don't belong to no one. She stays here 'cause I say so." The second rancher spat into the dirt. "She's a filthy stray, got thief's blood in her veins. She'll eat you out of house and home, bring shame on your name. You think contracts'll keep comin' your way once folks see what you're harborin'." The sheriff raised his hand as if to quiet the insults, though his own tone wasn't much softer. "It ain't just about you, friend. This town runs on reputation. You take in trash like her, you drag us all through the mud." Behind him, the girl had crept closer to the door, clutching the quilt he'd given her. The words "filthy stray," "thief's blood," "nothing worth saving," sank into her ears like knives. She shrank against the wall, her breath coming shallow and quick. The rancher's hand hovered near his revolver, fingers brushing the worn grip. He didn't draw, not yet, but the set of his shoulders, the iron in his eyes, warned them all he could. "You men got a lot to say," he growled, "but not a one of you stepped foot inside my house, nor seen the hunger carved into her bones. You call her names 'cause it's easy, but if she eats my bread, it's 'cause I gave it. And that's all you need to know." A tense silence fell. The men shifted, muttering. One of the ranchers sneered, "You'll regret this. You'll lose contracts, lose neighbors' trust. You'll stand alone." The rancher took a step forward, the porch boards groaning under his boots. "Then I'll stand alone. Done it before. Ain't afraid to do it again." Hands twitched near holsters. For a heartbeat, the air was thick with the promise of gunfire. The girl gasped softly from inside, her eyes wide with terror, but no one drew. The rancher's stillness, unyielding as granite, was a weapon sharper than steel. His words, steady and low, carried more weight than bullets. "Go on home," he said at last, voice rough as gravel. "You got no say in what happens under my roof." One by one they faltered. The sheriff was the last to meet his eyes, but even he dropped his gaze. With muttered curses and threats that rang hollow, The men turned back toward the dark. Lantern light bobbed away until only the quiet of the prairie night remained. The rancher closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, his breath steady, though his blood still thundered. Behind him, the girl whispered, "They hate me." He turned, his expression softening only for her. "Let him. Their hate don't reach past these walls." She swallowed, eyes shimmering, and for the first time she believed him. The tension that had smoldered for weeks finally ignited on a cold Saturday morning. The clang of the town's iron bell drew people to the square, merchants closing shutters, ranch hands dusting off hats, women tugging shawls tighter around their shoulders. By noon the heart of town thrummed with expectation. The rancher came in slow, his boots steady against the hard-packed dirt. At his side walked the girl, her small hand buried in the folds of his coat. She kept her chin low, wary of the whispers snapping like whips around her. There she is, the barn rat. Stray, same as her folks must have been. She'll drag him to ruin. Every word found its mark. Her shoulders hunched further, her eyes fixed on the ground, as though if she didn't look up, their hatred couldn't touch her. But the rancher's stride never faltered. He stopped at the center of the square, the girl half hidden behind him, and turned slowly to face the gathering crowd. "You've all had your say behind closed doors," he began, his voice deep, carrying across the murmurs. "Now you'll hear mine." The crowd shifted uneasily. No one interrupted. He gestured toward the girl, who flinched at the attention. "You call her a stray, a beggar, filthy and worthless. You measure her worth by her rags and her hunger, by the fact no one claimed her." His gaze swept them sharp as a blade. "But her life ain't yours to measure, in coin or in cruelty. She's worth more than your mockery." Gasps rippled. A few men scowled, muttering under their breath. One rancher spat and barked, "She's nothing. She'll shame your name, drag your house through the mud." The rancher's hand twitched near his revolver, but he didn't reach for it. Instead he stepped forward, voice like thunder. "You think shame comes from feedin' the hungry, from givin' a child shelter? No, shame's what you carry, mockin' a girl who's never raised a hand against you, laughin' at her sorrow, 'cause it made you feel taller." The words struck harder than fists. Faces shifted, eyes dropped. The girl peeked out from behind him, her breath trembling. She had never heard anyone speak of her like this, not as a curse, not as a burden, but as someone worth defending. Tears welled, hot and unbidden, but she didn't hide them this time. The sheriff, red-faced, tried to salvage control. "You don't speak for this town." The rancher's gaze snapped to him, cold and unyielding. "I speak for what's right. If this town's too blind to see it, then it don't deserve the name of a town." A hush fell thick and heavy. No more jeers came, no more laughter. Men shuffled their boots, ashamed to meet his eyes. Women lowered their heads. Even the children, who'd been taught cruelty by example, watched in wide-eyed silence. The girl's tears broke free and earnest now, streaking down her dirt-stained cheeks. She stepped out from behind the rancher, her small hand gripping his sleeve tight, as though she might fall without it. The weight of his words wrapped around her like a shield, breaking apart the years of silence and hunger that had pressed her down. She pressed her face into his coat, and sobbed raw, open, unashamed. For the first time in her life, her tears weren't mocked, they were safe. The rancher rested a hand on her shoulder, steady and sure. He didn't speak further, he didn't need to. His defiance had already silenced the crowd. When he turned to lead her away, no one dared follow. The sound of their boots faded down the street, leaving the square heavy with the echo of his words. For the girl, the moment burned itself into her heart. She was no longer nameless, no longer unwanted. She had been claimed, not as a burden, but as someone worth standing for. And for the first time, hope lived where hunger had once been. The town's whispers still lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire, but the rancher didn't carry them home. His boots fell steady on the dirt road, the girl's smaller steps hurrying to match his. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the land in hues of gold and crimson. Inside, the house glowed with the warmth of a crackling fire. Supper was simple, stew and bread, but to the girl it was a feast. She ate quietly, glancing up now and then, as though afraid it might be her last meal there. The rancher said little, though his eyes softened each time they landed on her. When the bowls were cleared, the silence between them grew heavier, not uncomfortable but expectant. The girl sat curled in the big chair by the hearth, clutching the blanket he'd given her. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the wary hope in her eyes. She looked like a creature caught between two worlds, still braced for hunger, yet daring for the first time to believe in plenty. The rancher stood for a long moment, staring into the flames. His hands, scarred from years of labor, tightened at his sides. Then, with a quiet breath, he crossed the room and knelt before her. The shift startled her. Men of his stature didn't kneel for anyone, much less a ragged child. "You listen close," he said, his voice low, steady as stone. "You'll have my roof and my bread. You'll have my fire to keep you warm. But more than that," he paused, his gaze locking with hers. "You'll have my name." Her lips parted, eyes wide as though she hadn't heard him right. "Your name," she whispered. He gave a single nod. "A name means you belong, means you ain't alone in this world anymore. You're mine now, not to mock, not to cast out, but to cherish, to call family." For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the girl dropped the blanket and threw her thin arms around his neck. The sobs came fierce and unrestrained, not the quiet tears of shame she once hid, but the flooding release of a heart finally unchained. The rancher held her close, his rough hand steadying her small back. The years of loneliness carved into his soul seemed to ease with every tremor of her embrace. He hadn't set out to find redemption, yet here it was, pressed against him, fragile and fierce all at once. The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth as the night wrapped around the ranch. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but within those walls, it was quiet, safe, new. No longer was she a starving orphan sneaking crumbs from a barn. No longer was he a man living in silence and shadow. Together they had forged something stronger, a bond born not of blood, but of choice. When she finally pulled back, her cheeks wet, her eyes shone with something he hadn't seen before, belonging. She whispered, almost reverent, the name he had given her, her name now. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, and smiled, faint but true. "That's right, don't ever forget it." And she wouldn't. Not as long as she lived. The world had cast her aside, but the rancher gave her more than bread. He gave her his name, and with it a future.